Paul's letter to the Galatians is considered one of the greatest documents of freedom in the history of early Christianity. With statements like, "For freedom Christ has set us free," and "You were called to freedom, so do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence," we can see why. According to Paul, Christ's coming has significant consequences for being fully free and becoming fully human. This freedom, however, does not allow us to ignore how our behavior affects others. In fact, as Paul argues, this newfound freedom in Christ is the true way to being in full relationship with others. Herein lies the secret to the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5. Such fruit as in love, kindness, and gentleness are not granted for an individual to develop personal virtues for the sake of themselves. Rather, they are given so that we do not become conceited, competing against one another. They are given so that we consider others more highly than we do ourselves. Brad Braxton will guide us through the first century tensions in Galatia and the significance of Paul's message of freedom for the developing Jewish-Gentile multi-ethnic community of faith.
Galatians presents an impassioned ancient conversation about the religious and social boundaries of the church. In the first century CE, the Apostle Paul established Gentile congregations in the Roman province of Galatia, which corresponds geographically to modern-day Turkey. Paul exhorted the Galatians to commit their lives to God through faith in Jesus Christ. Through faith in Christ, the Galatians could enter God's covenant family and receive blessings in this life and the life to come. Although Jesus was a Jew, Paul insisted that faith in Jesus Christ did not obligate Gentiles to convert to Judaism through rituals such as circumcision. After Paul's departure from Galatia, other preachers arrived in the province, declaring a very different message from Paul's. Paul, in his letter to the Galatians, suggests that these missionaries are agitating his converts with distortions of the gospel. These so-called agitators apparently considered complete submission to the Torah as a requirement for Gentiles to enter the church and insisted that the Galatians had to become Jews in order to be fully Christian. For Paul, the submission of Gentile Christians to the Jewish law constituted a form of slavery. Such submission implied that the Galatians could not enjoy the blessings of God's covenant unless they abandoned their ethnic identity and assumed another. Yet, if Gentile believers adopted another ethnic identity, they would deny that God had saved them as Gentiles. So in Galatians, Paul grapples with these pressing questions. What is the relationship between the Jewish law and Christian faith? How does social diversity manifest itself in the church? And what is the nature of Christian freedom? Determining Paul's view on the Jewish law is a complex task. For centuries, many persons have read Galatians through the lens of the 16th century religious reformer Martin Luther. Those interpreters influenced by Luther have argued that Paul's primary concern was the doctrine of justification by faith, the teaching that belief in Jesus Christ and not the keeping of the Jewish law restores the individual's broken relationship with God. Interpreted through the lens of justification by faith, Galatians presents a plan for how individuals are saved from a sinful existence. According to this interpretation, the law stands in direct opposition to God's grace. Recently, however, some scholars have proposed a new perspective on Paul and the law. According to the new perspective, Paul's words in Galatians are not an outright assault on the law. Rather, Paul asserts that divine grace and human works of the law were not mutually exclusive. In Galatians 2:15 through 16, Paul echoes the common Jewish belief that no person is justified from the works of the law. Jews knew that justification, the state of being in a proper covenant relationship with God, was ultimately a result of God's grace. Jews fulfilled the works of the law, such as circumcision, eating proper foods, and keeping the Sabbath, not to earn God's favor, but as a sign that God had already granted them favor. The depiction of ancient Judaism as a religion of works righteousness, whereby people tried to earn God's favor, is simply mischaracterization. The new perspective on the law claims that when Paul offers negative comments about the law, such as in Galatians 3, he is speaking generally about the effects of the law as they pertain to Gentile Christians, not Jews or Jewish Christians. Paul likely considered the law still to be binding for Jews and even Jewish Christians. But he is troubled by attempts to make the law normative for Gentile Christians. A preoccupation with the law causes Gentiles to misunderstand the universal nature of God's covenant, which persons enter through faith alone. In addition to this new perspective on Paul and the law, new views on the significance of justification by faith in Galatians have also emerged. These new views stress the social, communal realities in Galatians. For Paul, the doctrine of justification by faith was not an end in itself, but a means to an end. And that end after which Paul strived was the social and religious reconciliation of Jews and Gentiles, ethnic groups often separated by intense hostility. Through faith in Christ, Jews and Gentiles could overcome this hostility, thus allowing them to form a multi-ethnic religious community, the church. For Paul, faith in Christ provided access to God's grace beyond any narrow social boundaries. Since people could believe in Jesus Christ, regardless of their social identity, faith was the great social equalizer. Thus, justification by faith is more than a formula for the salvation of an individual believer. It is the principle that allows the church to express communal unity in the midst of social diversity. Regardless of our social differences, faith is our means of access to the God who has acted in Christ. This theme of unity in the midst of diversity is central to Paul's gospel, and he expresses this theme powerfully in his famous declaration in Galatians 3:28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is neither male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. Christian unity does not entail the abolishing of social distinctions. In fact, Paul designed his missionary campaign to bring Gentiles into the church as Gentiles, thereby ensuring ethnic diversity in the church. If Paul had advocated for the erasure of social distinctions in Galatians 3:28, he would have undercut his own argument. Why then would he erase the very diversity for which he had toiled? Indeed, it is clear that Paul pleads for the erasure of dominance, not the removal of difference. When people enter the Christian community through belief in Christ and baptism, they do not lose the social distinctions that have characterized their lives. Yet, Christ abolishes the dominance of one over the other based on these differences. Jews should not dominate Gentiles. Free persons should not dominate slaves. Men should not dominate women. Rather, Christians should foster harmonious relationships characterized by mutuality and respect for social difference. In addition to promoting communal harmony, Christian faith engenders freedom. Paul's letter to the Galatians is actually an ancient emancipation proclamation announcing that believers have been freed from enslaving forces and freed for loving service to the neighbor. In chapter 4, Paul reminds the Galatians that Christ has set them free from the elemental spirits of the world. These spirits are demonic forces that enslave both Jews and Gentiles by creating social strife and prejudice. As contemporary Christians, we would do well not to dismiss Paul's words about the elemental spirits as ancient mythology. Spiritual forces that create strife are alive and well in the church. Racial prejudice, discrimination based on gender or economic status, domestic violence, hostility toward gays and lesbians, greed, imperialism, lust, a preoccupation with warfare, and many other forces seek to destroy our communities and distort our Christian witness. Christ came to redeem us from these spirits, but we must be willing participants in the redemptive process. Christ sets us free from these demonic forces, and our liberation calls us to address compassionately the concerns of our sisters and brothers. In Galatians 5 and 6, Paul establishes an ethical paradox. Christian freedom manifests itself in slavery to the neighbor. Love, not restrictive chains, binds believers together in a community of care. When we bear our neighbor's burdens, we fulfill the law of Christ, which is the law of love. Ultimately, love is the only law that matters and the only law that will last.